We've all been there. That moment when something or someone pushes the wrong button, and before we know it, anger takes over. Our heart races, our mind narrows, and we feel the heat rise. And in that split second, we face a choice to let anger control us or take control of it. Staying calm when anger strikes isn't about suppressing emotions, it's about understanding them. The first step is recognizing the trigger. Anger doesn't come from nowhere. It's a response to something, an unmet expectation, a perceived injustice, a moment where we feel unheard or disrespected. When we pause to understand why we're angry, we create space between stimulus and response. And in that space, we find power. That's where the pause matters. When emotions are high, logic is low. Have you ever said something in anger and regretted it later? That's because anger shuts down our ability to think clearly. But if we take a deep breath, count to 3, or even just step away, we reclaim control. We remind ourselves that reacting in the heat of the moment rarely leads to the outcome we actually want. Perspective is another powerful tool. We often assume the worst they did this on purpose. They don't respect me. This is unfair. But what if there's another explanation? What if the driver who cut you off is rushing to the hospital? What if the colleague who snapped at you is battling something you don't see? Asking what else could this mean shifts us from frustration to understanding. And let's not forget anger is energy. It's a force that can destroy or build. History has shown us that the greatest leaders don't eliminate their emotions, they channel them. Instead of yelling, they speak with conviction. Instead of lashing out, they turn anger into action. The key isn't to ignore anger, but to use it with purpose. Finally, the antidote to anger is empathy. The moment we realize that every person we meet is fighting a battle we cannot see, we begin to lead with patience instead of frustration. We see the human behind the mistake, the struggle behind the harsh words. And suddenly, anger loses its grip on us. So the next time you feel anger creeping in, remember this: you are not your emotions. You are the one who chooses what to do with them. And in that choice lies your true power. Anger is a natural human response. It's an emotion that arises when we feel wronged, unheard, or frustrated. It's a signal that something is out of alignment. But the way we handle anger is what defines us. When anger takes over, we often react without thinking. Words are spoken that can't be taken back. Actions are taken that create regret, and relationships can be damaged in ways we never intended. The key to staying calm isn't to suppress anger, but to understand it, create space before reacting, and channel it into something that serves us rather than controls us. The moment we feel anger rise, our body reacts before our mind has a chance to catch up. The heart beats faster, breathing becomes shallow, muscles tense. This is the body's fight or flight response, a system designed to protect us in times of danger. The problem is most of the situations that trigger anger in daily life aren't life-threatening. They're misunderstandings, frustrations, or unmet expectations. But our brain doesn't always know the difference, so it responds as if we're under attack. If we don't recognize this in the moment, we let that instinctive reaction take over, leading us to say or do things that don't align with who we truly are. That's why taking a pause is one of the most powerful tools we have. It sounds simple, but in the heat of the moment, it's not easy. When someone cuts us off in traffic, when a colleague makes a passive-aggressive comment, when a friend or partner says something that stings, our instinct is to snap back, to honk the horn, fire back with a sarcastic remark, or raise our voice to defend ourselves. But in those moments, we have a choice: react impulsively or take a breath and reclaim control. Pausing doesn't mean ignoring anger or pretending everything is fine. It means giving ourselves space to decide how we want to respond. A deep breath, a 3-second count in our head, physically stepping away. These small actions shift us from reacting emotionally to responding intentionally. They allow our logical brain to catch up with our emotional brain, giving us the chance to ask, what's really happening here? Imagine you're in a meeting and a colleague dismisses your idea without a second thought. Immediately, frustration rises. Your instinct might be to cut them off, prove them wrong, or shut down altogether. But if you pause for just a moment, you give yourself time to reassess. Maybe they're not undermining you. Maybe they're just focused on their own perspective. Maybe they're dealing with their own pressures. Maybe they didn't even realize how dismissive they sounded. That brief pause allows you to approach the situation with curiosity instead of hostility. You might ask, can you share more about why you think that? Or I'd love to explore this further. Instead of escalating tension, you open the door for a productive conversation. This applies beyond the workplace. Think about personal relationships. How many arguments spiral out of control because of a knee-jerk reaction? Someone says something hurtful, and instead of taking a moment to process it, we snap back. The argument becomes less about the issue and more about who can win. But if we pause, if we breathe, we can separate emotion from intention. We can choose to ask, is this worth the fight? What do I actually want out of this conversation? Often the goal isn't to prove a point, it's to be heard, to be understood, to find a solution. And that only happens when we create space before reacting. Even outside of direct conflict, pausing helps us navigate daily frustrations. When we're stuck in traffic, waiting in long lines, dealing with unexpected challenges, our immediate reaction might be irritation. But frustration doesn't change the situation, it only amplifies our stress. Taking a deep breath, shifting perspective, and accepting what we can't control helps us move through these moments without unnecessary tension. The ability to pause before reacting is a skill, and like any skill, it requires practice. The more we train ourselves to take a breath instead of lashing out, the more natural it becomes. Over time, we become less reactive and more intentional. We gain control over our emotions instead of letting them control us. And the impact goes beyond our own well-being. It influences how others see and respond to us. When we stay calm in difficult moments, we create an environment where others feel safe, heard, and respected. We set the tone for more meaningful conversations, better relationships, and stronger leadership. Staying calm when anger takes over isn't about being passive. It's about being in control. It's about recognizing that our first reaction isn't always our best reaction. It's about understanding that true strength lies not in the ability to overpower others, but in the ability to remain steady in the face of chaos. The next time you feel anger rising, remember that power lies in the pause. Take a breath. Step back. Give yourself a moment to choose how you want to respond. Because in that choice, you don't just control your emotions, you control the outcome. Anger is a powerful emotion. It comes quickly, surging through us before we even have a chance to process what's happening. It makes our hearts race, our vision narrow, and our words sharp. But in those moments when anger takes over, we have a choice. Do we let it control us? Or do we take control of it? Learning how to stay calm isn't about suppressing anger. It's about understanding it, creating space before reacting, and shifting our perspective to turn frustration into clarity. Most of the time, anger isn't the real problem. It's a symptom of something deeper: frustration, fear, disappointment, or even a sense of powerlessness. When we feel unheard in a meeting, when a loved one criticizes us, when we face unexpected challenges, anger is often a mask for something else. Recognizing this is the first step to mastering it. If we pause long enough to ask ourselves, why am I really upset? We might realize it's not just about what was said or done, it's about how it made us feel. And when we acknowledge the true source of our frustration, we give ourselves the ability to address it in a way that actually leads to resolution rather than regret. The pause is what creates that opportunity. It sounds simple, but when we're caught up in the heat of the moment, it's one of the hardest things to do. The natural instinct is to react immediately, to defend ourselves, to retaliate, to prove a point. But that instinct rarely leads to the outcome we actually want. The power of the pause is that it gives us time to shift from reaction to response. A deep breath, a few seconds of silence, even stepping away from the situation, all of these small actions create space between the trigger and our reaction. And in that space, we regain control. Imagine being in a situation where someone speaks to you with disrespect. Maybe it's a colleague who dismisses your idea, as a friend who makes a sarcastic remark, or a stranger who's rude for no reason. The immediate impulse might be to snap back, to prove that we won't tolerate being spoken to that way. But in that moment, if we pause, we give ourselves the opportunity to choose a response that serves us rather than sabotages us. Maybe the best response is silence. Maybe it's asking a calm but firm question. What do you mean by that? Maybe it's deciding that the situation isn't worth our energy at all. But without that pause, we don't give ourselves the chance to choose, we just react. And reactions, especially ones fueled by anger, often create more problems than they solve. Once we've paused, we gain the ability to shift our perspective. Perspective is one of the most powerful tools we have when dealing with anger. In the heat of the moment, we tend to assume the worst. They did this on purpose. They don't respect me. This is unfair. But what if we challenge those assumptions? What if we asked ourselves, is there another way to look at this? A driver cuts us off in traffic and our first thought is, what an inconsiderate person. But what if they're rushing to the hospital? A colleague interrupts us in a meeting and we think they have no respect for me. But what if they were just caught up in their own idea? A friend forgets to return a call and we assume they don't care. But what if they're dealing with something personal? The truth is, most of the time, people's actions aren't about us. They're about them, their stress, their distractions, their struggles. And when we shift our perspective, we move from frustration to understanding. Shifting perspective doesn't mean excusing bad behavior. It doesn't mean tolerating disrespect. What it does is help us respond from a place of clarity rather than emotion. When we assume the worst, anger takes over. When we choose to consider other possibilities, we regain our power. We get to decide how we show up in the situation. The way we handle anger affects everything: our relationships, our work, our leadership, and even our health. People who react impulsively often regret their words and actions later, but those who learn to pause, reassess, and choose their response build trust, respect, and influence. They create stronger connections with others because they don't let emotions dictate their actions. They become the kind of people others look up to, not because they never feel anger, but because they know how to manage it. The next time anger rises, recognize that it's not just about what happened, it's about what runs underneath it. Take a breath. Pause. Give yourself the space to choose a response that aligns with who you want to be. And remember, true strength isn't about overpowering others. It's about having the discipline to control yourself when it matters most. Anger is one of the most powerful emotions we experience. It comes quickly, often without warning, and can take control of our actions before we even have a chance to think. It's a reaction to feeling wronged, disrespected, or frustrated. But anger itself is not the problem. The way we handle it is. In those critical moments, we have two choices. We can let anger dictate our actions, or we can take control and respond in a way that aligns with who we want to be. Learning to stay calm when anger takes over isn't about ignoring our emotions. It's about understanding them, creating space before reacting, and shifting our perspective so that we can use anger as a tool rather than a weapon. Anger is rarely the root emotion. It's often a mask for something deeper: fear, disappointment, insecurity, or even exhaustion. When someone cuts us off in traffic, we don't get angry just because they merged in front of us. We get angry because we feel disrespected or because we're already stressed, and that small inconvenience adds to the weight of the day. When a colleague dismisses our idea, the anger that follows isn't just about their words, it's about feeling unheard or undervalued. Recognizing the true cause of our anger allows us to manage it more effectively. Instead of lashing out, we can ask ourselves, what am I really upset about? This shift in thinking turns anger from an uncontrollable reaction into an opportunity for self-awareness. The key to mastering anger starts with one simple but difficult action: to pause. When emotions run high, logic runs low. Reacting in the heat of the moment often leads to words and actions we regret later. The ability to pause even for a few seconds gives us control over our response. A deep breath, a moment of silence, even stepping away from a situation can create the space we need to think clearly. Without this pause, anger drives impulsive decisions. But with it, we give ourselves the power to choose how we respond. Pausing doesn't mean suppressing emotions. It means acknowledging them without letting them dictate our actions. Imagine being in a heated discussion. The other person says something that feels like an attack, and your instinct is to fire back. But if you pause, even for a brief moment, you create room to decide whether escalating the conflict is worth it. You might realize that the other person is speaking out of their own frustration, not necessarily to hurt you. You might recognize that responding calmly will lead to a more productive conversation. Without that pause, you risk saying something that turns a minor disagreement into a full-blown argument. Once we create space, the next step is shifting our perspective. Anger thrives on assumptions. When we feel slighted, our minds immediately create a narrative: they don't respect me. They did this on purpose. This is unfair. But what if that narrative isn't true? What if the person who cut us off was rushing to the hospital? What if the colleague who dismissed our idea was distracted by something happening in their personal life? What if the friend who didn't respond to our message wasn't ignoring us, but was overwhelmed with their own struggles? The way we interpret situations determines how we feel about them. If we assume bad intent, anger intensifies. If we challenge our assumptions, we open the door to understanding. Perspective is powerful because it allows us to shift from frustration to curiosity. Instead of reacting with anger, we can ask, what else could be going on here? This doesn't mean allowing people to walk all over us or ignoring real issues. It simply means that before jumping to conclusions, we give ourselves the chance to see a bigger picture. And often, that bigger picture reveals that the situation isn't as personal or malicious as it first appeared. But managing anger isn't just about reacting better, it's about channeling that energy into something productive. Anger, when used constructively, can be a powerful motivator. Some of the greatest movements in history were fueled by righteous anger. People saw injustice, felt frustration, and turned that energy into action. The key is directing it in a way that creates positive change rather than destruction. Instead of yelling in frustration, we can speak with conviction. Instead of lashing out at someone, we can use that energy to find solutions. When we learn to harness anger, we stop being controlled by it and start using it as a force for progress. This ability to stay calm in the face of anger is what separates strong, respected individuals from those who are constantly battling their emotions. It's what builds trust in relationships, credibility in leadership, and peace within ourselves. People who react impulsively often find themselves apologizing for words they didn't mean, fixing problems they created in the heat of the moment, or dealing with damaged relationships. But those who pause, shift perspective, and channel their energy wisely create stronger connections and better outcomes. The next time anger rises, remember that it's not just about what happened, it's about how we interpret it and how we choose to respond. Take a breath. Pause. Ask yourself what's really going on. Consider another perspective. Then decide how to act in a way that aligns with. As she sat watching the world go by, something caught her eye. It wasn't so much its color or shape, but the way it was moving. She squinted to see if she could better understand what it was and where it was going, but it didn't help. As she continued to stare into the distance, she didn't understand why this uneasiness was building inside her body. Anger is a natural human response. It comes when we feel wronged, unheard, or disrespected. It's powerful, immediate, and if not managed, can take over before we even have a chance to think. But anger itself isn't the enemy. The problem arises when we let it control us rather than learning to control it. Staying calm in the face of anger doesn't mean pretending we're not upset. It means understanding where the anger is coming from, creating space before we react, shifting our perspective, and finding a way to use that energy in a way that serves us rather than harms us. The first step is recognizing that anger is often a symptom of something deeper. It rarely exists on its own. It is usually fueled by frustration, disappointment, insecurity, or even fear. When someone cuts us off in traffic, it's not just about them merging in front of us, it's about feeling disrespected or out of control. When a colleague dismisses our idea, it's not just about that one comment, it's about feeling undervalued. When a loved one forgets something important to us, it's not just about the moment, it's about feeling unimportant to them. When we pause long enough to ask ourselves, what am I really upset about? We gain clarity. And when we gain clarity, we are less likely to react in a way we'll regret later. Pausing is one of the most powerful tools we have when dealing with anger. The instinct to react is strong, our brains are wired for it. Anger triggers the fight or flight response. And if we don't take a moment to catch ourselves, we act on impulse. That's why taking a breath, stepping away, or even counting to 3 can make all the difference. It creates space between the trigger and our response, allowing our logical mind to catch up with our emotions. Without this pause, we risk letting anger dictate our words and actions, often in ways that escalate the situation. But with it, we give ourselves the power to choose a response that aligns with our values and goals. Once we create space, we need to challenge our initial assumptions. Anger thrives on the stories we tell ourselves. When something upsets us, we instinctively assign meaning to it. They did this on purpose. They don't respect me. This is unfair. But what if that's not true? What if the driver who cut us off is rushing to the hospital? What if the colleague who dismissed our idea was simply distracted? What if the loved one who forgot something important was overwhelmed with their own struggles? Changing our perspective doesn't mean ignoring bad behavior. It means giving ourselves a chance to interpret the situation in a way that doesn't make things worse. It means replacing assumption with curiosity and frustration with understanding. When we do this, we take away the power anger has over us. But understanding and perspective alone aren't always enough. Anger is energy. It doesn't just disappear. If we don't channel it productively, it turns into resentment, bitterness, or regret. Some of the greatest changes in history have come from people who turned their anger into action. The key is directing it in a way that leads to a solution rather than destruction. Instead of yelling, we can speak with conviction. Instead of lashing out, we can use that energy to push for change. Instead of holding on to frustration, we can turn it into motivation. When we learn to channel anger, we stop being controlled by it and start using it as a force for progress. At the heart of all of this is empathy. Anger is often a reaction to feeling misunderstood, but what if we flip that? What if, instead of focusing on how we feel wronged, we focused on what the other person might be going through? Every person we encounter is carrying something we can't see. The rude stranger, the impatient coworker, the distant friend, they may all be fighting battles we don't know about. When we lead with empathy, anger loses its grip. We begin to see people not as obstacles, but as humans, and that changes everything. Mastering anger is not about never feeling it. It's about recognizing it, pausing before reacting, shifting our perspective, and choosing to use that energy in a way that makes things better rather than worse. The next time anger rises, take a breath. Ask yourself what's really happening. Challenge your first assumption. Consider another perspective. And decide to respond in a way that reflects not just how you feel in the moment, but who you want to be in the long run. Because true strength isn't about overpowering others, it's about having the discipline to control yourself when it matters most. Anger is a powerful force. It comes quickly, often without warning, and can take over before we even realize what's happening. It can make us say things we don't mean, act in ways we later regret, and create damage that's difficult to undo. But anger itself is not the problem the way we respond to it is. Staying calm when anger takes over isn't about pretending we're not upset. It's about understanding where that anger is coming from, creating space before we react, shifting our perspective, channeling that energy productively, and leading with empathy rather than assumption. When we learn to master these steps, we don't just control our anger, we transform it into something useful. Anger is rarely just about the moment. It is usually a symptom of something deeper: frustration, fear, disappointment, or a sense of being powerless. When someone speaks to us in a dismissive tone, it's not just about their words, it's about feeling disrespected. When we're stuck in traffic and someone cuts us off, it's not just about the inconvenience, it's about a lack of control. When a loved one forgets something important to us, it's not just about the moment, it's about feeling unimportant. If we take a step back and ask, what am I really upset about? We often find that anger is masking something else. Recognizing this shifts our focus from reacting emotionally to understanding what's actually happening beneath the surface. That understanding alone, however, isn't enough. The key to managing anger in the moment is learning to pause. The human brain is wired for immediate reaction. Anger triggers the fight or flight response, which pushes us to act before we think. But if we don't slow down, we let emotions dictate our actions, often in ways we regret. The pause is powerful because it creates space between the trigger and our response. It can be as simple as taking a deep breath, counting to 3, or stepping away from the situation. That brief moment allows logic to catch up with emotion, giving us the chance to make a conscious choice rather than impulsive reaction. Without it, anger controls us. With it, we take back control. Once we create that space, we can shift our perspective. Anger feeds off the stories we tell ourselves. When something upsets us, we immediately assign meaning to it. They did this on purpose. They don't respect me. This is unfair. But what if that story isn't true? What if the person who cut us off in traffic was rushing to the hospital? What if the colleague who interrupted us wasn't dismissing our ideas but was just caught up in their own thoughts? What if the friend who didn't respond to our message wasn't ignoring us but was dealing with their own struggles? When we challenge our first assumption and consider another possibility, we take away anger's fuel. We realize that not everything is personal, and that shift in thinking can prevent unnecessary conflict. But even perspective alone isn't enough. Anger is energy, and energy needs to go somewhere. If we don't channel it productively, it festers into resentment or explodes in ways that damage relationships. Some of the greatest movements in history were driven by people who turned anger into action. The key is using that energy to create solutions rather than destruction. Instead of yelling, we can choose to speak with clarity and conviction. Instead of lashing out, we can direct that frustration toward problem solving. Instead of holding on to bitterness, we can use it as motivation to create change. Anger, when controlled, can be a powerful force for progress rather than something that tears us down. At the core of all this is empathy. Anger often comes from feeling misunderstood, but what if we flip that? What if, instead of focusing on our own frustration, we considered what the other person might be experiencing? Everyone we encounter is carrying something. We don't see the rude cashier, the impatient driver, the distracted friend. They may not be acting out of malice, they may be struggling in ways we don't understand. When we lead with empathy instead of assumption, we give ourselves the ability to let go of unnecessary anger. It doesn't mean we tolerate disrespect or ignore our feelings, but it does mean we don't allow anger to dictate how we treat others. Mastering anger isn't about never feeling it. It's about recognizing it for what it is, pausing before reacting, shifting our perspective, channeling energy productively, and choosing empathy over assumption. The next time anger rises, take a breath. Ask yourself what's really going on. Challenge the story you're telling yourself. Consider a different perspective. And decide to respond in a way that reflects the person you want to be, not just the emotion you feel in the moment. Because true strength isn't about overpowering others, it's about having the discipline to control yourself when it matters most.